the last take for the night. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Let us know where you're coming, where you're zooming in from, as we're letting people come into the Zoom. So exciting to see some familiar names. I woke up in the morning feeling fresh to death. I'm so blessed. Yes, yes. I went to sleep stressed, woke up refreshed. I'm so blessed. Yeah, yes. Water in my face and everything is in its place. Peace of mind, even my grace. I'm so blessed. Yes, yes, yes. My grandma almost lived to see 92. I'm so blessed. Yes, 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 yes. My son was born healthy and beautiful. I'm so blessed. Yeah, yes. My mama's on the right side, daddy on my left. My son, father doing is absolute. I'm so blessed, 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 blessed. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Great. So as we're flying people in, just a couple of announcements. Captions are going to be available for the webinar. Attendees' videos are automatically turned off. There will be a recording for this event, but only for classroom use. And please use the chat to communicate with one another and with our presenters. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the webinar. It's just the way it is. Ain't nothing coming easily in this life. Let's get started. So we are ecstatic to welcome you to Dr. David Stovall's talk at the Virtual Institute for Emancipatory Education. I am Rebecca Burciaga, Faculty Executive Director of the Institute. Last I checked, we had about 290 people registered for the event. So I was really excited to have you all here. The Institute is a center that focuses on cultivating approaches to education that nurture the creativity and brilliance of all learners through community-engaged research and emancipatory pedagogies that support the redesign of learning from preschool through post-secondary education. We've been in discussions with community partners and we met with our visioning team today, and we're really excited about moving this work forward with such committed individuals. So please stay tuned for more as we continue to grow. I'll hand the mic over to Dr. Pizarro.
Hey, thanks, Rebecca. Welcome, everybody. I'm Marcos Pizarro. I'm the Associate Dean of the College of Ed here at San Jose State, and just thrilled to have the Institute for Emancipatory Education putting in work this semester for you all. Hopefully some of you were able to see Tara Yasso do her thing a couple of weeks back, and that was just really an amazing opportunity for all of us to think about what it looks like to engage in emancipatory education. It is a big word, it's a big idea, but we are thinking about this in terms of praxis, in terms of how we live that work. And I'm so grateful to have David Stovall with us today, because he is all about that praxis, all about that living, transformative, racial justice oriented work. And that's what we're aspiring to in the College of Ed here at San Jose State. To be engaged in work where we are living it, where we are on the ground, working with people where they're at, centering the beauty and the power of our BIPOC communities, and bringing that forth to transform the university. So it is just, such a joy to be here with you all. And we were just doing that. Like one example is like our ethnic studies residency programs out at Overfelt High School, and Tiffany and I were just over there working with teachers and teacher candidates, trying to learn how to engage in just amazing work. So we'll have to bring Tiffany and her work into this space at some point. But that's all I'm going to say. Just grateful for y'all being here. I hope you'll make the most of it. Use the chat, blow it up so we can see what's going on, where you're at, what you need. And be sure that you're taking care of yourselves and you're looking for all the work that's to come from this amazing institute and the incredible work of Dr. Burciaga. So thank you for all you're doing and leading us. And I believe my job is to pass it over to Tiffany.
Greetings, everyone. I have the esteemed honor of attempting to introduce myself as well as David Stovall. And I was joking earlier that I would probably need an entire session to be able to truly honor this man and his work. But I'm gonna try to tell two stories that I think capture both my work as well as the privilege that you will all experience in a second. when I first started, actually about 7 years in, and I was just telling this part of this story with Marcos and teachers. When I began to shift my practice, and I was tired of trying to align so much of what I was doing with schooling, and I wanted to step outside and really truly be able to offer young people an education, or as we say here, an emancipatory education. I realized that I was full of potential, but my pockets were quite empty. And so I wanted to travel the world with young people. I wanted them to gain a greater sense of themselves and the world around them. And I needed to find some funds to do this. And so we created this brand, Hope Dealer, as a way to really raise money so that 100% of these proceeds could support the work that we wanted to do. And we were at T4SJ, a Teacher for Social Justice conference one year. And Stove was the keynote speaker. And we were trying to figure out how we were going to sell these shirts because our young people were excited about this trip. I think we were going to Puerto Rico that year to a school called Nuestra Escuela that had done away with grading. And so we wanted to focus on this framework. And I hit up Stove and I said, Stove, can you help us out? And Stove was like, I got you. In Stove fashion, I got you. And little did we know that what he meant by that, he was, from the shy, he was just fresh. And he took our shirt and he put it on for his keynote. And I mean, y'all should already know the outcome of that. But we sold out probably within the first 2 hours. We hadn't done that because they had listened to this man. And if you know Stove, he's all about, he embodies what he's saying. And I'm sure that folks were captivated at the end of that keynote. They said, we need that shirt because maybe we could be like him with that shirt. So we sold out. We started seeing Hope Dealer around the country. We shipped some Hope Dealer to to Paris, one hoodie to Paris. So I don't know if you were responsible for that, but if so, thank you. But so much of that was intimately connected to this work. And so we were funding these trips. We were traveling with young people. We were able to do a lot more than we had been able to do when we were confined in the classroom. And part of what became really fascinating to me later in my work is it started to intersect with public health. And we began to understand the impacts of our critical pedagogy and the physiological impacts that it was having on young people and their bodies. And so we were excited about bringing this work to our school communities and continuing to spread this work. And largely when we would share our findings, that we were literally finding that our work, our ethnic studies interventions, our critical pedagogies were extending the lives of our young people. We had quantitative evidence that affirmed that. When we sought to advance the work, to spread it, to scale it, teachers were fearful. Teachers were doubtful because largely what we heard is that we cannot do this work in schools. How could we make this framework fit in schools? And the answer was simple. We can't. Not in the ways that we know schools and schooling. Very simple. And so we were struggling, myself and Kendris Watson, he was at UCLA at the time, we were struggling with this. And we're like, who has talked about this work? And this is years after Stove put on that shirt. And we were like, we're looking up school abolition. We come across this article on school abolition that was written in 2018. Where Stove, I would imagine 2016, 2017, we know the trajectory of how long it takes to get these pieces out, but was already asking us, are we ready to truly center our young people as the blessings that they are? Are we ready to abolish the ways of being that compromise their health? In 2018, I need you to understand the caliber of who's in front of you and who's going to bless you today. Stove is the type of mentor who, as I mentioned, will literally take the shirt off his back to support the work, community grounded, centered work. When you hear from him and you feel, and I know you're going to feel it across a computer screen, I want you to understand the legacy is that Stove knows that anybody who's willing to utter the words of abolition, it's also folks who understand that this is intimately and maybe even inextricably tied to Blackness and Black people in this country. And so when you see that energy and vibrancy coming from him, understand as I study genetically, that he embodies the spirit of our ancestors, who, regardless of a number of people who were aligned with a system that was compromising our health and our well-being, who said, it's time for that to go. Are you ready? And so I need y'all to understand, because you may or may not be ready, but I'm asking y'all, are you ready? For the man for decades has been asking us to abolish frameworks that were compromising our communities, that have been compromising our health and our well-being. Are you ready for the one and only David Stovall, who comes to us from the Chi, who works and does his work at the University of Illinois, whose work has been focused on critical race theory, the intersections between housing and education, who has flawlessly engaged us in conversations around race, place, and school? Are you ready for a man who not only theorizes, but we see him in communities? We see this brother. I haven't seen anybody fly across the country as much as I've seen David Stovall fly across the country. It's an event in Oakland. If it's an event in Oakland next week, he's probably there. Are you ready for a man who's that committed to this work? If not, he's coming anyway. Without further ado, I'd like to present my brother, my mentor, David Stovall.
Look, y'all, first, let me say to Sister Marie, I do not feel that I am deserving of any accolades, but Sister Tiff, thank you for putting me on to the understanding of why we have to do this work. And it is a deep honor to not only be introduced by you, but to be in your presence and to work with yourself and folks like Kenjis Watson in terms of shifting what it is that we do and the ways in which we do it. Right. So thank you so much. I feel like we need like superhero music coming through, but it's just funky old me. So all apologies, y'all. And I want to thank specifically Rebecca Burciaga for even thinking about somebody like me to even participate in something like this, because the work that you all are doing at the Institute for Emancipatory Education is not only important, but it has a particular challenge to it, right? And I want to say peace to all my San Jose State fam, Marcos Pizarro, who I've known now for almost 20 years. Like Marcos, I can say that now, it's been that long, right? So now we have gone back to see how this work makes sense, whether it was him with Maestros, myself with Social Justice High School in Chicago. So to just give thanks to the fam, because we don't see each other enough. So it's really important to be in presence with you. And saying some more to more San Jose fam, Johnny Ramirez, Christine Vega, Maria Ledesma, and Tariaso, who's now one of the IEE fellows. And I say their names because in this space, it becomes important to recognize the people who are here with us. I come to you all from Chicago. I'm from a space that is a place of the Council of Three Fires, where 15 indigenous nations banded together to fight white supremacy. And I think it's important because it's not just this idea of a land recognition, but it is an understanding of the continued struggle that is happening, right? So it's not about acknowledging folks just who have passed on, but the willingness and understanding that they are still here, right? And because they are still here, what is that particular representation? And I'm really thankful for IEE, because Rebecca, in this space, you know, I'm usually used to being uninvited to spaces, but man, the fam got me here. So I know it won't be too hectic, because y'all already done got in trouble for doing what you do in the way that you do. And I think it's really important to be in concert with you all and to tell the truth, right? So this thing, I'm going to try to do a couple of things in our short time together tonight, but the main thing is to put us into a couple of things, not just understanding CRT, abolition, and praxis, But to get into this point around what does it mean to be emancipatory, right? Because in too many instances, we get into the power of rhetoric, and the rhetoric is not lived, right? We got hella people talking about social justice this, social justice that, and then when we turn around, it's empty, right? Or it's doing something minimal. So now when we talk about something that is emancipatory, I think we got to really get into this thing around understanding something, right? If something is emancipatory, it means that it is freeing us from something. So we have to be clear around what is it that we are freeing ourselves from. And in too many instances, when we don't mention that, everything else goes to the floor. So now, if we are clear about an emancipatory education, we also have to be clear around what is it that we are freeing ourselves, or more importantly, what has us in bondage, right? And in so many instances, we talk about this only rhetorically, right? But let's think about this. What actually keeps you in bondage, right? What keeps you going back to the spaces that are built around your suffering? And now, what is the commitment that you have because these spaces are built around your suffering and you are still compelled to engage them? I'm talking about schools, right? And it is a solemn piece because I want to recognize everybody for surviving the 3 pandemics of COVID-19, white supremacy, and capitalism. We only think about the first one, but the other 2 have been here for quite some time, and we go without recognizing them. And when we go without recognizing them, we become further victimized by them. So now, when we start to think about those 3 pandemics, and remember, pandemic just means a problem across region, nation, or world. So now, when we start to think about an emancipatory commitment, we have to be clear about what it means to free ourselves from the bondage of white supremacy, from the bondage of capitalism, right? And it's tough because food prices have gone up, and y'all out on the West Coast living in the Bay, it is not cheap. So now when we think about those particular contradictions, we now have to think about an emancipatory education is one that is willing to name the enemy. And when you name the enemy, there is no other work forward, right? There is no other place that you can go to because now you are clear, right? So if we are freeing ourselves from white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, right? We now have to think about what are the practices that actually engage us in a way that both challenge us and affirm our humanity. And I think a lot of times when we think about education, we wrongly think about things singularly, right? And it's not about this single space. Remember Audre Lorde's point, right? We don't experience singular oppressions, right? We have the multiplicity of the ways in which we show up in the world. And because we show up in the world in this particular way, we now have to be willing to challenge things in a way that not only is direct, but is deepening our intentionality, right? So if you are deepening intentionality, it means that you are willing to say certain things are not working. And more importantly, I think we have to grapple with this when we talk about schools. Certain things for certain people never were intended to work. So now when we grapple with that, we have to do something completely different. So I view the Institute for Emancipatory Education as one that's saying there has been too much that has not worked, and now what are we willing to do? And now how are we willing to open up the spaces where we are educating ourselves? And again, I think it's really important. I say this quite a bit, but I'm making this distinction between school and education, right? School being the orthodoxy, the rewards that you're given for regurgitating the rules of white supremacy, right? Education is asking a question of that. Education is saying those things are unacceptable. And because those things are unacceptable, we are now willing to do something different. And let me go into praxis, because a lot of times, you know, I always appreciate you, Marcos, because you hit us with that. And a lot of times people forget it, right? Remember, praxis is action and reflection in the world in order to change it, right? So it is not an empty term, right? It's a verb. You are literally engaging in praxis because you have identified these things that do not work. We have all been asked, everybody on this webinar has been asked to suffer through school. But more importantly, we've been asked to refuse our education because they're two different things. We are suffering through this thing that dehumanizes us, and education tells us that we instantaneously have to stop that. We have to stop the practice of dehumanizing ourselves. We have to stop the practice of lauding the views and values of Western Europe and dehumanizing and thwarting indigenous African values from our understanding. And the question that we have to ask is why? And when we begin to ask these particular questions, it now pushes us into a different set of work. Now, I don't want to push this thing onto you all and say that it is straightforward work. It is difficult work, but the work is difficult because in it, we are always asking questions of ourselves, right? This is the end of mediocrity, right? We have to be able to end those practices that we know don't mean a thing to young folks, nor should they. And now, because they should not, now the work becomes, how do we identify the practices that allow us to engage our work on our terms while building with community who have been excluded, right? And this is the age-old question. And this is why everybody is so up in arms about critical race theory, right? We're in this moment, right? Remember, y'all, last summer, not this past summer 2021, but summer 2020, more people saw what Black and brown folks have been telling the world for 400 years. And now that more folks saw it, people got a little more upset, but they missed the point. There were folk in the street who said, this thing is unacceptable. And because it's unacceptable, it has to go. So a lot of folks got scared and said, oh shit, this thing might get burned down. To the point that they let an orange dude who has never done anything in his life except inherit stuff from his father tell you that an election was stolen. So all those white folks on January 6, 2021 went to the Capitol to go to rob their own house because they were lied to. The question around education is, why were people believing that lie? And what does it mean to now go into why that lie became truth? And before misinformation campaigns, y'all, there's a larger indictment on the US schooling system. And we have to remember the words of Kevin Kumashiro. He always says, look, the US schooling system was never intended to educate anyone. It was to create spaces for people to work for power, who were largely white male land or industry owners. That's not conjecture, right? That is the factual purpose of school. Read the work of Noah Webster, read the work of Thomas Lancaster. They're talking about this, right? This isn't our conjecture, but it's literally people naming this. So now when we begin to think about this, what does that indictment on US schooling mean? And let's go back to Orange Dude, but I got to give you another story before we get into Orange Dude again, right? So a guy named Christopher Rufo in March of 2020 was on Fox News. He is talking about microaggressions and his problems with the term microaggressions. He's saying that people are over-exaggerating these experiences. They're not racist, they're misunderstandings, and people have gone all out of proportions with this, and policies have been changed in ways that disadvantage white people. In March of 2020, when Christopher Rufo was on Fox News, Donald J. Trump was watching him. He looks at this and he says, oh, we got a problem. In April 2020, a month after he saw Rufo, he creates Executive Order 13850 that bans the use of critical race theory in any federal training or the use of any critical perspectives that speak badly about the United States. And here's how we get to this moment. So you got a bunch of people around the country who have no clue what critical race theory is, and now are in 18 states who have banned its usage. So let's think of the absurdity of this. There are literally 18 states that have banned something that no one in the state really understands what it is. So now, what is this really about? Because in one way, it's about critical race theory and what critical race theory names. Critical race theory names that the United States is founded on slavery, genocide, and wrongful land appropriation in the form of settler colonialism. Period. That is not David Stovall's conjecture. That is the words of Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Quincy Adams, and George Washington. So now, if we understand this to be true, Derek Bell said, we have to understand racial justice work. And that racial justice work in the United States is only advanced to the extent that rich white populations are still advantaged. And he called that interest convergence, right? And we see that in the criminal legal system, right? Kyle Rittenhouse's trial ended today. The jury starts to deliberate, and many of us are fearful of the outcome because Kyle Rittenhouse is understood as valuable and as a reflection of power. And he did what power does. It eliminates the threat. So now when we come into this particular understanding, critical race theory says, well, wait, if we look at the United States, we also see something else. We also see that those who have been deemed white, there are assumptions placed on their body. And those who have been deemed other are thought of as disposable. So now it becomes important, going back to IEE and what we are emancipating ourselves in terms of emancipating ourselves from in terms of white supremacy, we have to be clear around what white supremacy is. So as I am talking to you, I understand white supremacy to be the perceived views and values of white, Western European descended, able-bodied, cis hetero, Christian, able-bodied males as normal, right, and good. Everything else has been othered. Everything else has been made strange. Everything else has been made the repository for gratuitous punishment that is rationalized through things like the criminal legal system, right? Again, not my conjecture, just look at the founding of the penal system. Look at the ways in which police were created. Police were created in the South to recuperate property, which were enslaved Africans. In the North, they were to dispel riots and uprisings. That's a very clear history of police. So now, when we think about this in 2021, why would we not see a reflection of those particular things. Critical race theory says because we were never paying attention to them. We were always trying to obfuscate them. We were always trying to push them away. We were always trying to say that they did not exist. We always were trying to say that it was a figmentation of people's imagination of the things that were happening to them. Kimberly Crenshaw comes out and says, well, wait, the US criminal legal system is not just a race and class system, it is also a gendered system. And when we look at the bodies of Black women, we can actually see in the decisions of courts that they said you had to choose the ways in which you were discriminated against. It had to be either race or gender. And Kimberly Crenshaw said, no, it's not just race, class, or gender, it's age, ability, sexual orientation, cis politics. And now when we start to think about this in real time, we're asking the question. So this current issue is about critical race theory, but it is about something else. It is also about engaging a critical perspective. It is about you not being able to ask a question of the thing that you are suffering through. And it creates a system of punishment if you speak back against your suffering. And just think about it. You know, all of us who have been in school space, now, when we think about those good teachers that we've had, we got to ask the next question. Why were those teachers always in trouble? Why were those teachers always the ones who were castigated? Why were those teachers less concerned about school and more concerned about education? And now what does it mean to incorporate what they were giving to us and to create cadre of people who can do the same thing? And this is where it gets difficult, because these are direct questions. So we're in this moment where people are fearing or have stood against critical race theory without understanding it, without reading it, without engaging it. The only thing that they are determined to protect is their power or perceived power. So now, when we are emancipating ourselves from these things, it has to be us explicitly naming them. And no one is spared in this, because there's a certain thing about white supremacy that we learn from people who study colonization. White supremacy does not work without people of color who agree to it. It does not work without people of color who capitulate to it. It does not work without people willing to do the work of white supremacy who look just like you. It is impossible for it to work. And because it's impossible for it to work, we now want to throw you trinkets, right? The society wants to throw you trinkets. They want to make you vice provost of the fax machine, right? They want to make you the new dean of the toilet, right? They want to give you these, they want to give you a position that on your business card is a paragraph long. And it means absolutely nothing. You go to meetings about meetings. Let's keep it 100. So now, what does it mean to interrupt that practice? And that's what I see in IEU. I see an invitation and a provocation to end the practice of dehumanization in education. I see a practice to end and free oneself from the bondage of white supremacy. I see that as being able to name it. I see it as being able to understand it. And I see it as a commitment to be able to name your allies. Because again, we're talking about collective work. So now, this particular CRT moment, and a lot of my colleagues who do race work, you know, they're saying to me, well, you know, I was caught off guard by this. What? What do you mean? That is only white supremacy, white supremacying. You didn't expect that, right? Folks, literally, think about this. People literally burned the country down and you didn't think they was gonna bang back? Come on now. So now if we think about that in this particular moment, we now have to be clear because this happened 60 years ago. Remember, there were over 300 uprisings between 1966 and 1972 in the United States. They actually issued a report called the Kerner Report from the Kerner Commission that in its first pages said, Black people in the United States, along with other oppressed groups, have found their conditions intolerable. If we do not address their issues and concerns, we will not be able to quell their rage. This is 60 years ago. So now, at the same time, why wouldn't you think them to do something in the same range? Why wouldn't you think them to flood community organizations with guilt money, right? Why wouldn't you think that they now give you these 2 seconds in schoolhouses to now do some diversity, equity, and inclusion work that really got you out there as an N of 1 with no support? We didn't expect that. And critical race theory said we not should have only expected that, but we should live in recognition and to see it coming before it happens, right? So this thing around an ally is only proven, it is not spoken, because we are in this moment, right? Folks will talk major noise and not do anything. And that's purposeful. So as they are talking that particular noise, it is used to distract you. So now critical race theory says, what is the work beyond the distraction? And if we're willing to do that work beyond the distraction, now we're willing to interrupt things. We're willing to shake things up. We're willing to claim that things are unacceptable. And we're also willing to go to the historical record and say they have been unacceptable for a long time. This is nothing new. And I think that's important to note about critical race theory. Critical race theory is a continuation of the critical historical record, of the critical gendered record, of the critical record around sexual orientation. It is a continuation of the critical record of ethnic studies by saying that US schooling is intended to fool you. And if you become fooled by it, and if you agree to that particular manipulation, you will continue to be manipulated by it. So now, if you are emancipating yourself, you are ending the practice of manipulation. So now when we start to think about this in particular time, in particular space, now we have to think about, well, what is next? And I'm very thankful to be introduced to have been introduced to the concept of prison abolition. Because here's what we know. Prisons nor police deter or stop crime. We got 80 years of data on this, right? Longer sentences do not reduce crime. More policing does not reduce crime. What it does do is arrest a bunch more folk and put folks in deeper precarious situations that become harder to get out of. Please read the work of Devon Carbata. When he talks about Ferguson and how Ferguson actually, police department, had a strategy around revenue and how to upcharge people when they handed out tickets, right? That was a practice of the department, right? Read Eric Garner's report around police killings, right? This is the Attorney General, right? Talking about Chicago, right? Because, I know in the national media, everybody starts tripping on Chicago. Oh my God, Stovall, you're from Chicago. Have you been shot? right? And I'm always saying to myself, look, y'all, it's a lot more complex than what the media is telling you, right? And you can't put displacement, gentrification, disposability, disinvestment in the sound bites. It's too many syllables. So every homicide that you see in Chicago or any other space is connected to something. And if you are talking about ending that practice, you have to be even more committed to understanding what that particular instance is connected to. So now, when we begin to talk about our work, and prison abolition says that punishment is not a deterrent for crime, nor does it prevent crime. Punishment is an extension of slavery. Punishment is an extension of possession. So now, when we begin to look at this particular work, abolition says there is something else possible. But we often miss this thing in our discussions of abolition, because people only talk about this kind of anarchistic commitment, right? Oh, we just got to burn it all down. But there's a deeper commitment. There's a commitment in our grandmother's wisdom. There's a commitment in the wisdom of our people. Whatever it is that you are trying to tear down because it is unacceptable, there is even a greater commitment to build something anew. So now abolition is not this thing around just getting rid of something. Abolition is saying there is a deeper commitment to build because the things we have do not work. So now if these things do not work, what are we willing to build? Who are we willing to build it with? What is included in those spaces? And now, how do we think about a different world that we build step by step, right? What does it mean to think about our practices that now push us to think about what does it mean to do something differently? When Tiff sent folks to Puerto Rico to study a school that didn't have grades, there's a school here in Chicago called Young Women's Leadership Academy that also does not have grades. And then if a young person is struggling in that space, it is the commitment of all teachers to get that young person up to speed, right? No more rewards for regurgitating the rules of white supremacy. Now we think about our education as the enhancement of what we bring into the space and the skill development to work with others to change the condition, right? And folks have been doing this for time immemorial. Please read Jarvis Givens' Fugitive Pedagogy, where he's talking about Black women in the Southeast who were willing to say, no, the regulations by the district, we're not doing none of that. Here's what we're doing. Please read Vanessa Siddle Walker's The Lost Education of Horace Tate, where these Black women teachers told the NAACP Defense Fund that the goal of the Brown decision is not to sit next to white babies. The goal is for us to be represented for the dollars that we have already given these folks to get what it is that we need. And now because they didn't give it to us anyway, we got to start again and rebuild it. Please study Fannie Lou Hamer. Please study her commitment to environmental justice in her last years of life. Please look at Ella Baker. Please look at how she was committed to young folks, and she told King, Andy Young, Stokely Carmichael, and all those folks that charismatic leadership is only going to get you so far. What we are talking about is the willingness to build people power, the capacity of folks to see their conditions, work, and change those conditions. Please read about Pauli Murray. Read her biography, Song for a Weary Throat, because what she says, and for people who do not know Pauli Murray is the person who actually wrote the thesis that said that the Plessy v. Ferguson decision was unconstitutional. Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the dean of Howard's Law School, gave Pauli Murray's paper to Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was arguing Pauli Murray's point, and we forget that. We often tell young folks the story of Rosa Parks, but we don't tell the story of Rosalind Colvin, who actually was the young person in Montgomery who refused to give up her seat. And now, Claudette Colvin, please excuse me, who refused to give up her seat. But the leaders in the particular area of Montgomery didn't want her to be the face of the Montgomery bus boycott because she was a pregnant teen. We gotta understand what it means to engage in critical perspectives, right? And you have to engage that thing because what it does, it interrupts the lie. It allows you to go back to the historical record. It allows you to understand that abolition is a commitment, right? It is a preoccupation because we know the things that we are engaging are unacceptable. So now, what does it mean to move with abolition and to build out praxis? Right? This action and reflection in the world in order to change it, right? And now when you think about that work, it becomes different, right? I won't say it becomes easier, but it becomes different because now you're clear, right? You are either serving white supremacy or you are not. You are either capitulating to power or you are not. You are either building with the folks who have the solutions or you are not, right? And a lot of times people want to grade this up. No, this commitment is clear. Now, how you navigate that commitment is another story, but you have to be clear. So I see critical race theory and abolition as pushing us towards clarity. And in that clarity, we now have to think about what does it mean to build with others. And there's another thing that abolition reminds us. The people who have experienced the injustice have the greatest understanding of what the justice condition should be. And academia fools us into distrusting that. Academia fools us into believing that because we read some shit, that we know some shit. And if you work with people, you will quickly understand that you don't know shit, right? And because you don't, you got to get yourself back in order and humble yourself and be with the people that know the things that will free them. So now, how do you utilize the resources based on the justice condition named by the people experiencing the injustice? And here's the other thing. You also got to see yourself, right? Because this thing, we get fooled in academia. You got a lot of Black and brown folks telling us, well, what's wrong, Rebecca? You're just doing too much complaining. What's wrong, Stovall? All this stuff is just getting you in trouble. What's wrong, Marcos? What is this? Tiffany Marie, what are you doing? And you have to say, this is exactly what I'm doing. I'm working for a day where you no longer have to capitulate. I am working for a day where you are able to tell the truth to yourself first. So now, if we're willing to tell the truth to ourselves, what does it mean? Who do we join in this fight? What is the work? Are we willing to fail? Now, that's real talk, because in abolition, you read some folks, and when you read into it deeply and you start to see what folks talk about addressing things like sexual violence, you see when people talk about things like transformative circles, you see how people grapple with failure, because we live in a world that is deeply dominated by white supremacy and capitalism. And we don't want to run from that. We want to be clear about that. And we want to do all that we can in the way that we can to see that our practices reflect something different. Not just for the face of it because it looks a particular way, but literally because it is changing our perception and understanding. And when we change our perception and understanding, we are able to do our work differently because we are seeing things differently. So this current battle against critical race theory is also a battle against the historical record. So now, what does it mean to engage the historical record? And to the critical K-12 educators out there, now we have to ask the question, what does it mean to be in solidarity with you? Not in word, but to literally engage in that practice, to be in a schoolhouse, not as the expert, but with some folks who got some resources that you all can now utilize, right? To be with community organizations and saying, we got some resources that can be put in the ways that you all have determined. This is not about a brochure. This is not about the new hip thing. This is not about you going on social looking slick. This is about really being clear that this work is longitudinal work. It's work that takes everything out of us, right? And also with critical race theory and abolition, what it also pushes us to do is to think about how do we do this work for the long term, right? And that's the more difficult thing, right? Because, we can get, y'all seeing me, you can see me get hella hot, hella charged, talking and what have you. But the thing is, when the lights go off and it is just me by myself, what does it mean to do this work in a way that I am caring for myself and other people? So when we talk about self-care, it is not indulgent. Self-care should always be understood as an extension of collective care. I am good because we are good. And now, when you start to build that out, it moves you away from those rewards of the academy, right? It removes you away from trying to look slick, right? Or trying to say things about yourself that are not true. It is challenging you to come to grips with the contradiction of the academy, right? Please read and watch Joy James, because she's telling you about what does it mean to be in a space that always wants to de-radicalize your movements. So now, abolition and critical race theory are reminding us how to keep the volume up, how to actually understand that in order to do that, we have to take care of ourselves. Because COVID was the thing that was killing us quick. Your capitulation to white supremacy can be a slow death. And now, what does it mean to interrupt all of that work? What does it mean to stand in the face of those things that would rather not see you here, nor do the work in the way that you do? What does it mean to now engage in emancipatory praxis, action and reflection in the world that is intentional about freeing oneself from bondage? And now, when you name that, now the work is in front of you. It's no longer behind you. It is the work that challenges you to be in community with folks, not to claim that you have some newfound solution that you could sell to the next school district. It's literally around saying this work is situational. This work is akin to each universe of the schoolhouse, right? Because schoolhouses are their own universes, just like neighborhoods are their own universes. There are commonalities that are shared across those spaces, but there are instances and nuances in that space that now require us to have the knowledge of those particular machinations so we can do our work differently, right? And another thing that it requires us to do, it requires us to be able to identify the folks who are already doing the work. You cannot Columbus justice work. You cannot come into communities saying that you found some shit and stuff is already happening. Now, how do you live in recognition of those things that are happening? And now what are you willing to do to humble oneself in those spaces? Because in too many instances, this machination of degrees starts fooling us, right? It starts fooling us into believe that we know some stuff, and that becomes highly problematic. And if we are not careful, we continue the same colonial relationship that communities have had to, that universities have had to communities, right? We repeat that same extraction that we've seen in our communities. We repeat that same practice of dispossession that we've seen. So now the interruption is pushing us in a different space. It's challenging us. Our work is different. We have now named what it is that we're trying to do. Abolition says the elimination of the things that have harmed us is just the first part. The hardest part is to build something anew. There have people who have done it, but we have tried to erase them from the historical record. So now, when we claim them back, we now have to be willing to learn from them. And again, I repeat this ad nauseum because it's different work, because again, it is inward facing work. So you could do the outward facing things that you have named. There's no process of you engaging in healing work or putting out healing spaces without you engaging in the healing. We are not damaged people. We are people who have survived white supremacy and are surviving white supremacy. Now we make a decision on how do we take care of ourselves. The damage is not inherent. The injury can be healed, but we have to engage this. And Tiff, it's important for me to say publicly, that's why I really appreciate you and Candace's work, along with Shireen Hannigan-Martinez's work, along with Tracy Buenavista's work, because what you all are reminding us is that trauma is an injury. It is not a pathology. And now when we take into account the injury, what is the healing? And now when we no longer look at our students through this deficit lens, we are now saying there's always the capacity to heal, but now we have to engage that because that's where our work is taking us. Abolition reminds us that any person is capable of harm. And because any person is capable of harm, we must be even more diligent in the practices that replenish us and renew us. We must be overcommitted to the places that bring us joy over the places that bring us degradation, isolation, and marginalization. And that's hard. Because in this time, it's easy to shut things off and just to go into our little foxholes and be done. But now, the work is saying that's unacceptable. We can't do that. And because we can't do it, now we have to lean on each other. We have to get through this, because if we do not, more of the same will continue to kill us. And again, I don't want to leave you all with, Stovall gave his talk and he said we all gonna die. No. Even more important is that commitment to joy, right? The joy we find in us, the joy we find in doing work in a way that frees us. Joy in understanding that it is not if the enemy is coming, but recognizing that the enemy is here and has been here for a long time. Joy in saying the enemy will not fool you. And because the enemy will not fool you, it is impossible for them to take your joy. And that only comes through us. So again, I see IEE, the Institute for Emancipatory Education, as a place that's challenging us to get there. A place that's challenging us to do quite a bit of work, but a place that is also reminding us of the collective joy, if we commit to doing it, and a joy that is found in community spaces because people believe in the practice of doing this particular work, right? So now, when we understand this, it's a different practice, right? It's a different way of doing and knowing. It is a way for us to be not only at peace with who we are, but to also recognize what it means to stand and fight, right? And abolition saying, in building these new things, we need to understand what it means to create things fugitively, right? Or as our comrade Michael Dumas says, fugitivity means that you have made that you are not free, but you have made a decision to run. The issue is that you are not running from something. You are running to something, and you are running to something with the people you trust, love, and build with. So now those teachers that we understand in that work, they were always working fugitively. The district said something, they were like, look, I'm not worried about what the district is saying. Here's what I'm about to do. Those teachers who were saying, look, all right, look, the test is saying that you should answer in this particular way, but we got three things: what the test says, what we know, and the truth. I want you all to make a decision. So now, when we start to think in those ways, it does our minds and our bodies different, right? I work with a colleague in 4th grade. His teachers had him do a reenactment of Nat Turner's rebellion. I'm like, damn, if I was in 4th grade and a teacher came in the classroom and said, who wants to be Nat Turner? What? Right? So now when we think about this particular work, it not only pushes us, but now it is a reminder, right? So abolition is a reminder of the work that has been done, and now a challenge of the work to be done. And critical race theory says that we can no longer capitulate to the rules of white supremacy because they were never really intended to do right by you. And now you have to do something different. And I think the work that you all have set forward in your practices, in your programming, in how you all are situating yourself and rooting yourself in community is deeply important. And I want to live in recognition of that, but at the same time, offer that challenge. If we are emancipating ourselves, let us be clear what we are freeing ourselves from. And the bondage of white supremacy are the chains that must be broken. And if you are not clear about those, you could end up harming the people that you say you care about. So now, how do we do that work, right? So thank y'all for rocking with me for this this little while, and thank you, Tiff, for the most beautiful but undeserved introduction. But at the same time, I just want to thank the folks at IEE. I hope this was making sense. I hope that, I'm just a regular dude from Chicago who is saying, look, we can do what we do differently. And those things that are unacceptable, we've known them for quite some time, right? So they I guess we can just open it up for some questions.
Yes, indeed. I want y'all, however you can, in the chat to show some love. Y'all have been doing it throughout, but use the chat right now to continue to show some love for what you were just blessed with. And we're gonna jump right in because I think we have limited time. And for folks, please use the question option if you have questions that you also want to submit. Some folks already have. And I'm gonna start with my own since they gave me a mic. You opened up at the beginning, and I think one of the first things you said, I was like, oh no, we gotta come back to that. And when we were writing our recent piece, we were talking about this going back, this idea of going back into this thing that harms us. And so I'm hoping you can spend a little bit more time there. When we think about Resmaa Menakem's work, he shares that talk therapy is not enough, and that our healing, our freedom, it has to be, he engages the somatic, right? But you are engaging, I think, the psychology here. And so my first question to you is, because I think on this chat, on this call, on a number of calls, we have a number of people who will agree 100% with the theory that you shared today. My question to you is, what do you think causes us to go back into the spaces that are built around our suffering? What do you think it is that compels us to go back?
I think, and thank you so much for that question. I think it's that contradiction of capitalism, right? I think that's one of the first urges, right? And the contradiction of capital just meaning, folks got families, folks are trying to, we got wages that we're paid, and then we use the wages to make sure that family members are taken care of or what have you, right? And we live in this wage system and an exchange based on money or credit that we can't get for housing or what have you. So I think the first part of that is that contradiction of capital. I think the second part of it, and that speaks to the psychology and how we get manipulated, is folks get fooled into things saying to themselves, well, it can't be that bad, right? I think that's the thing that gets folks back. I think that's the thing that gets people back more than anything. This idea of, well, it can't really be that bad. And that to me is an indictment on US schooling, right? Because how many times did we hear 5.5 years ago, well, it can't be that bad. Damn, y'all got Obama. And I'm like, did y'all hear the man when he told you that he was a moderate centrist? Y'all just didn't want to believe him, right? He told you, but you didn't want to believe him. But now this thing around how we get duped into saying, well, it can't be that bad. You got folks who are making money and you say, well, look, for every Oprah Winfrey and Michael Jordan, there are literally 40,000 people in their proximity who are suffering in some type of way, right? So now I think this thing around, and then even when we look at this economically, right? And so I appreciate Andre Turner and his work at Brookings, because now what we see is that poverty hasn't just increased, but it's deepened, right? So now when we see that poverty is actually deepened with particular populations, and you all know this better than most people in the Bay when you pay attention to it. So now when we start to think about that particular work, it's the mechanisms that fool us into believing that it's not that bad, right? And I think that really becomes the impetus into pushing us to go back to those spaces that harm us.
Thank you for that. So we have another question that says that, and this is from our audience, it says, you pushed us to name our enemy. And this person asked, well, what happens, what do you have to say in response to what happens when the enemy is actually within? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and the person who wrote that question, thank you for that, because this is when you have to ask a question, the inward-facing question of, what is it that I am doing? And how am I contributing to the harm of the people that I say I care about? And if I am doing this, what is the practice that I can engage to end it, right? Not end your life, not take you away from this, but to say, what are the other things that are humanly possible that I no longer have to participate in the harming of the people that I'm purporting that I serve, right? I think that question, that inward facing question, and not, that's not a question that you necessarily have, with the homies, maybe a trusted homie or what have you, but that's an inward facing question when you say, look, this ain't good. And I know it's not. And now, because I know it's not, who can I build with to engage in different practices in doing something different, right? That's what I always see abolition pushing us towards, right? Saying like, look, okay, this thing is unacceptable. So now what am I willing to do, right? Where am I willing to go to find out other ways of doing this, right? So the inward facing question is challenging us to go find the folks who are doing things differently. And the inward facing question is now saying, once I find them, I have to build community with them and figure out how I will do my work differently. Because again, that part is really around seeing folks practice their lives and everyday struggles differently, right? That becomes the most important, right? Because it's not, you just don't want this to be something that gets you to just walk away from it all, but you have to ask that critical question around, how is it that I am harming people and what will I do to end it, right? And now, more importantly, how will I build with others in creating this thing that does not harm people and allows for sustenance, development, and not development in terms of building buildings, but development in terms of our self-development, in terms of us being able to see each other and the possibilities therein.
Definitely. I appreciate that, especially in how you share with us that everyone's capable of harm. And so centering that and thinking about that, I appreciate that. We have another question that asks about this relationship between emancipatory education and interest convergence. And I think they're bringing in Derek Bell's work. So what do you think about, one, they ask, how does emancipatory education and interest convergence exist in the same place? And how does interest convergence become a tool for emancipatory education?
Well, I always think about, I got a comrade by the name of Jamel Donna, and he said something to me and I made me think about it. He said, interest convergence allows me to be at peace with the world that I'm in, right? So knowing that mainstream white society will only advance racial justice to the extent that mainstream white society remains in power. So now, if I understand that, then I move completely differently, right? So now I say, well, look, if I'm freeing myself from that bondage, now I know that if I am approached by mainstream society to do something, that it's a fail complete, right? That I actually have to be intentional about doing something else, right? So now I feel like interest convergence and emancipatory education exists in the same space, in that interest convergence frees you from trying to convert power, right? Because that's another thing, like people get into this thing, if I could only get them to see my point. And that's not the thing. It's like, look, what I want you to understand is that there are different perspectives. You may not agree, but here's the work that grouping of people have been willing to do. They are clear about their relationship to power, and they have decided to build their own, right? And I think that's the space where both exist, right? And I really like Jamel's point, because he's always just like, that made me free, right? So now I know this, I am free to do the work that I have come to do, right? And that, I think that's the space where we can think about it as them existing, right? One is liberating you from thinking that, you know, making the brand new Black and brown folks who got corporate gigs and can now talk on CNN is your liberation. No, emancipatory education says that it will take us being able to build out strategies that are speaking to us and our capacity to focus on the marginalized, right? So it's not the folks who are going to do well regardless, but it's the marginalized, because that's where our liberation lies, right? So I think I really take Jamel's point to heart in terms of thinking about interest convergence and emancipatory education.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about doing this work, especially in the Bay Area. That's a phrase. Doing the work. I'm doing the work. She's doing the work. He's doing the work. And we joke about whatever the work is, because sometimes that's very different work. But let's assume that everybody, when they say doing the work, means a commitment to emancipatory education. This next question says that organizers around the world who are doing that work are tired and they're burnt out. This person asks, how do we build solidarity amongst each other in the midst of that burnout?
Yeah, I think, and thank you for that question, because this is where the crux of the issue lies. Right now, and I think it's really important to say, it is rough. It is rough as hell for teachers, organizers, folks who are working in certain occupations. It's rough. And we need to live in recognition of that. I think two things. One is we have to figure out how to make space for each other. We have to be able to commit to find rest, right? And I think this is, it sounds simplistic, but, when people say, you can't, and you got to take it serious too, right? So you can't go on a mental health day and then just go get faded, right? That makes no sense, right? So this thing around, you have to be able to say, what is the commitment to our mental health? What is the commitment to our safety, longevity, and healing? And that has to be a very intentional practice, right? And it comes in these very grounded forms, right? So if you see another person going through it, what does it mean to say to them, man, look, I know it's a lot going on. You can share with me whatever you feel is comfortable, but at the same time, I just want to know that I see you maybe going through some things. So now, how can we be in support of each other? Notice I did not say, how can I help you? I'm saying, how can we be in support of each other? Because it's recognizing that we're both engaging in this, that we're both potentially going through these particular things. So we have to create space where we can be with each other, and we have to make space where we can rest and replenish, right? And in those spaces where we can be with each other, we have to be able to talk about those things that are contributing to our suffering, right? And I think it's really important in this day and age, because we're seeing a lot of premature death, right? And we're also seeing a lot of people leave work, whether it be community-based work, whether it be youth work, whether it be classroom space. And we're seeing lots of people of color leave this space because now it is being understood as untenable, right? So now we have to make space where folks can be with each other, where we can rest, replenish, and really get ourselves, retool ourselves in a way that is healthy and is also engaged in the work that we're going to do. I saw this in action this summer. There's a group in the Bay Area called the Center for Third World Organizing. And I was doing a project with them. And we had started to get to the month of June, and they were like, oh, we just want to let you know that we're out the whole month of June. And I was like, damn, damn, that's like, man, that's a serious move. And I was like, damn, all right. That and what they were saying was, this work is hard, and we gotta have ways for us to figure out what it is that we're trying to do. And because we have to give ourselves that rest, right? But in that rest, we just can't go off and just kick it and like saying, catch a fade every day, right? But instead, just really around doing our work in a way that allows us to replenish. And I thought that was just such a heady but smart move, right? To just be like, June, we shutting it down, right? And then we'll be back. We'll be back July 1, but trust, all of June, we out. And I was like, yeah, that's a really important, because, and I think it was really important because they did that organizationally, right? So they said, look, this isn't any stop to anybody's check. It's not, we're not gonna stop, the resources from flowing from what people need. But we're gonna do this, we're gonna retool, and then we're gonna come back in the ways that we need, right? And I thought that to me was something that we often think is antithetical, right? Because the other part that this moment has allowed us to do is saying, we're working ourselves to oblivion, right? And nothing is being addressed in that way, right? And because nothing is being addressed in that way, now we got to figure out different ways. And I thought that was just a really important strategy that they figured out collectively in terms of what they wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. I shade to that. I was just in a meeting today, and I was sharing with folks how nervous I am sometimes when people ask me how I'm doing, and I'm like the last person in the group, and everybody's this is, and that's the culture. And then inside I'm like, I'm great, but I'm nervous to say it in certain settings, because to be well is sometimes you're an outlier a lot of times in spaces that say they're committed to the work. To have had rest, to be coming off a fishing trip that I was coming off of, and be excited. I want to shift real quick, and I think this may be our last question before we hand it back. It's a good one because I just made it up while I was listening to you. So I was thinking about this term, the fact that Black people are on a recorded screen talking about abolition in 2021 is already mind-blowing to me. And when I think about, and I joke a lot about how Harriet Tubman, she didn't have a PR team that was posting like where they were meeting and what the conversations were going to be. But we're in an era now where abolition is something that tastes good in our mouths. Abolition is something that there's like gatherings for, and it's going to be posted somewhere else and publicized. And then I was looking at the chat, everybody's revolutionary books. It was Amazon links. And I'm like, what is going on? I'm just interested in how you make sense of how marketable and how digestible this idea of abolition has become.
Right. And I really kind of take to Joy James's point, right? I don't want to de-radicalize the term, right? Because I think we can talk about it in one way, but the point I always try to stress is it's different work, right? It's unseen. It's a lot of unseen work. It's work that's now going to have you think about the practices in the spaces that you are very differently. It's not this kind of call celeb, right? It's not somebody coming to the Oscars with a shirt that says, I am an abolitionist. It's like, nah. That can't be the freedom dream, right? The idea is, let us put in the ether something that is challenging us, and then let's do the work on the ground so we can exchange with each other and see where the possibilities lie, right? And I think that's always the thing, right? So I always appreciate there's a book company in the Bay called AK Press. They're not in the Bay, they're in Northern California, they're up in Chico. And they said, look, we are not a fan of capitalism, but that's the thing that we have right now to exchange goods so we can actually print more books. And I was just like, okay, and abolitionists refer to that as a non-reformist reform, right? It's not the thing that's going to free us, but it's something that we understand in the meantime that's pushing us to something else, right? So now one of the questions of abolition is, what do we do in the meantime to push us to something else, right? And I think that's really important, because in a lot of spaces, you know, folks can, because like you said, some of it is mind-numbing to me too. It's like, whoa, that really, we really just did this in a public forum, right? But at the same time, I know that the vast majority of this work, when we're serious about it, is unseen work. It's still unseen work, because it's those inward-facing questions that won't necessarily get purported in a forum like this. This is just a pathway. I see it as introducing folks to something and then saying that the work is different. And you have to be in spaces to experience that different work, right? And it's not just something that's just really thought about, because, you know, when people think about prisons, and then people think about, you know, it's hard for folks to conceptualize punishment as the improper strategy to address harm. People always think about punishment as the retribution for the offense committed, in opposed to saying, what if we consider all of the things that get us to this moment? No action is without consequence, but now do we understand, and can we engage in strategies that are willing to transform the condition? It is much harder work, right? Especially for folks who have been harmed, right? And now that's a different phase of work. I always tell folks, it's like, look, Miriam Kaba gave us a real lesson in the book, We Do This Till We Free Us. You got to read that chapter that she talks about R. Kelly. Man, I'm just like, yo, if you want to think about what this means, read that, right? I mean, because it's a whole different, it's an entirely different frame. And I think that type of honesty is the type of work that we have to engage. So I'm at peace with that fugitive work is much more unseen. And that is those are the practices that get us closer to abolition.
Ashe, ashe, ashe. We appreciate you, brother. And I'm gonna pass. I'm speechless. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it back over to both Marcos and to Rebecca to be able to close out. But thank you for this honor and being able to be in dialogue with you tonight. Appreciate you.
I truly appreciate it. Thank you so much for holding it down for me through the night and actually getting me situated to do what I was supposed to be doing.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Dr. Stovall. Phenomenal, as my family would say. I love seeing people share the love for you in the chat, and always, always, always bringing fire with no notes every time. And just reminding us that this work is also about connections and replenishing so that we can continue the work to make it sustainable. You are a gift, and I am so grateful. Thank you, Dr. Tiffany Marie, for your beautiful intro and for hosting the discussion. Dr. Marcos Pizarro, for always supporting this work. We are so grateful to have had you as one of our speakers. Thank you so much, Dr. Stovall, and I hope everybody has a great evening. Thank you for joining us. Take care of yourselves. Keep doing the good work. Marcos, want to say anything?
Oh, just really grateful, Tiff, for holding it down the way you did. So nice. And Stove for being who you are. Besides all that you shared, just being who you are, knowing that you're out in the world makes me feel better about all this work. So appreciate you.
Thank y'all again. Truly appreciate y'all.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Take care, y'all.